Welcome back to Firebox Print Studio. So far we've covered carving, inking and printing out block. Now in this video we're going to actually have a look at when we come to print. Unfortunately we don't always get a perfect print. So what I want to look at is the common flaws you'll come across, what causes them and how to fix them. We're also going to cover how to store your work to preserve it. When we're printing a relief print, we're actually after an impression which has a nice full or solid field of colour in the relief areas or the positive areas. And we want a nice crisp distinction between image area and non-image area. In this impression here, you'll notice there's small white flecks through the image area. This is what we often refer to as being salty, only because it looks like salt is being scattered across the surface of the image. It's actually an indication that not enough ink has transferred from the block to the paper. Now there are two main causes of this. It could be either not enough pressure has been applied or not enough ink has been applied. To try and correct the saltiness, if it is a pressure issue, while the paper is still lined up and on the block, you can lay it back down again and try and hand burnish those areas where the ink hasn't transferred, or you can spin it around and put it back through the press. Now if this doesn't correct the saltiness, it's a pretty good indication that not enough ink has been applied in the first place. So to correct that, you need to put more ink out on your slab and then roll up more ink onto the block before you print next time. In this impression, you'll notice the crispness of the lines isn't actually there and it looks like the details of the work are actually filling in. This is another pressure and ink problem, but it's normally caused by too much pressure or too much ink. To work out whether too much pressure has been applied, just flip your print over and have a look at the back of it. And if there's a really heavy embossing of your block on the back of your paper, it's a pretty good indication that maybe you're using too much pressure and you should back it off a little bit. You might also want to consider swapping out your felts and using a harder substance like Perspex or cardboard. So to regain the detail and crispness of your line work, you're going to have to wash all the ink off your block thoroughly. Have a look at your inking slab. You may have to cut it back and roll the ink out again, and then start building the ink up on the block all over again. But this time you may even have to adjust the way in which you're rolling up just to make sure you're not over inking one area as opposed to another. Now when you have an impression which is less than perfect and has some flaws in it, they don't always necessarily have to be thrown out. Some of them actually can be fixed, and I'll show you how to do that now. So the slightly saltiness in this image can be fixed by taking a kneadable eraser, molding it into a fine point, dipping that in a small amount of the printing ink and slowly and methodically tapping in the salty areas. You want to take care not to apply too much ink at any one time, otherwise the correction will stand out, and what we're aiming for is to be able to fix the print without anyone knowing that any corrections have been made. But if you do apply too much ink, simply remold the eraser to a point which has no ink and tap it in over that area, and you'll find the eraser will remove the excess ink and blend it in to the surrounding areas. Corrections can also be made with a good quality pencil, but please don't ever use permanent markers or pens on your work to correct any saltiness. I know it might look black when you initially do it, but the ink from those pens will actually travel through your paper fibres and stain it and destroy the work. Now unfortunately sometimes you may end up with grubby marks on your print. There might be fingerprints or lay marks or bits of ink. You don't know how they got there, but they're there. Sometimes they can be erased. There's several different ways of doing it, but the easiest way of cleaning, which we'll go through, is just using a soft eraser. Now before you get in there and start scrubbing away with your eraser, you want to make sure that the ink on your print is thoroughly dry. So like normally you leave it a few days to dry. And you also want to establish which way the grain is running on your paper. That's easy enough to do by flipping the paper over, taking the eraser and just working it in one direction, and then having a close look at the paper fibres. Now what you'll find happen, that if you are going across the grain or against the grain, the paper fibres will tend to fluff up, and we want to try and avoid that. So when we erase, we want to go with the grain so we don't rough up the surface of the paper. Now something we don't focus on enough as printmakers is, once the printing's over, is the actual storage of the work. Now, storage is really important, and I've probably seen more works destroyed by poor storage. Paper is really quite delicate, and it's like a sponge, and it's really susceptible to not just physical damage, but also damage from the environment, whether it be the humidity, acidic conditions in the air, or even, UV light. So it's really important to package and protect your work after it's dry by enveloping it in an acid-free environment. I use acid-free tissue. Make sure that each print is interleaved with acid-free tissue, and then wrap the whole edition in acid-free tissue again. I will also package my works in acid-free plastic sleeves in order to give them another layer of protection. Next, place the works in a folder that is robust enough to support the weight of the work and protect them from any bumps or scratches. I use acid-free foam core, and then store the work in a cool, dry environment. I know that an environment like this in the tropics can be quite difficult to find, but if you have an air-conditioned office in the art centre, you're much better storing your works on paper in there. So that brings us to the end of this video and this series on an introduction to relief printing. In the next video, we're going to focus on multicolour relief printing. But until then, happy printing, and I'll see you next time.